Robert Litwak is Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Rob, welcome back.
Thank you, John.
I want to talk to you about something we've been talking about for years, but it's here again, the Iran nuclear deal. If you listen to the campaign, we've heard general criticism from Mr. Trump and general defense from Ms. Clinton. What I want to hear is some specific thoughts from you on how the deal is playing out.
Well, the deal was negotiated and signed in July of 2015. Implementation began this January of 2016. And I think the technical assessment is that both sides are abiding by their obligations under the agreement. What you alluded to at the top of your remarks, namely the political prism through which we look at the Iran nuclear deal, really hasn't changed. And that goes back to a structural issue that we've talked about before, namely that the nuclear deal with Iran was a proxy for a more fundamental debate. In Iran, it's been a proxy, a stand-in for their unresolved debate about what kind of country they want to be, a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. And with the United States, it's been a stand-in for our debate about how do we deal with these so-called rogue states? Should we seek to change their behavior or to change their conduct? The fact that the Iran nuclear deal only addresses one aspect of Iranian behavior with respect specifically to the nuclear area, but doesn't address its other areas of activity, its role in Syria, in Yemen, its support, state sponsorship of terrorism, support for Hezbollah, etc. The fact that the agreement doesn't touch on those areas has opened the door for the criticism of the deal as not addressing these other areas. It went beyond, of course, the scope of the negotiations, but that's the persistent criticism.
And that's not going to change quickly or as a result of this deal.
It's not, and because the deal, to use the classic public policy, dichotomy, it was transactional. It wasn't transformational. It was a deal, not a grand bargain. And so those who are so critical of it are essentially loading onto the agreement a burden it never assumed and would have overloaded if they tried to negotiate it, namely that it would be a wholesale change in Iranian policy. It was a transaction. It opens the door to whether, within the course of the agreement, Iranian society might change and we might see changes in other areas, but it wasn't baked into this agreement.
So how much certainty do we have about what is baked into the agreement, the technical aspects of Iran's nuclear program?
A lot, because the verification regime in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, as the nuclear agreement is formally called, included intrusive and extensive verification procedures. It extends not only to facilities, but also to supply chains that Iran might utilize to obtain so-called dual-use technologies, both civil and military technology. So we have a good sense of what the Iranians are doing. It doesn't negate the possibility of cheating, but the Iranians would be running a big risk if they cheated, because when they have attempted this in the past, they've been discovered. So they would have to engage in it knowing that there would be a high likelihood of being found out.
How are our regional allies feeling about the conduct of Iran and the deal to this date?
They're uneasy. The Saudis, for example, that the diplomatic agreement with Iran, there's a concern that it might augur a tilt of U.S. policy toward Iran at their expense. But I think that the broader context of the regional scene right now is focused on the essentially what some have called the 30 Years War between Sunni and Shia that's playing out in Iraq with ISIS and in Syria with the civil war. And there it's a contradictory situation in which the United States is tacitly allied with Iran to fight ISIS in Iraq, but is at odds with Iran in Syria, where the Iranian regime is backing the Assad regime. Mm-hmm. So it's a contradictory situation, and the regional alignments shift from kind of one case to another.
Not just Americans, the entire world is playing the sort of what if game. What if Hillary Clinton? What if Donald Trump? Is there any reason to suspect that if Mr. Trump were elected that this deal would be in jeopardy? We just heard comments from the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization this week saying he didn't think so, that no matter who is elected president, the deal would move forward.
It's hard to say. I mean, certainly there would be continuity with a President Clinton. In the case of Donald Trump, who has been critical of the deal, there is a school of thought that wants, basically focusing on the gap that exists between presidential campaign rhetoric and actual presidential actions upon assuming office once they see that the alternatives are not very good. So that's a surmise, not something we know.
Sure. A final thought, Rob, is on upcoming signposts or markers that are part of the deal that we should be looking at. Are there checkpoints along the way that will tell us how we're doing?
It's less, decisive.
More of a continuum?
Sort of turning points or checkpoints than just the continuum, a continuum of compliance that we're on right now, where the International Atomic Energy Agency has access to facilities. They can monitor the activities of those facilities. There was a report in the German press that the Iranians were seeking to circumvent the export control regime that exists, the restrictions on Iranian exports to acquire proscribed materials. That would be something we would have to watch, where they're pushing the envelope of imports that are permissible under the JCPOA.
I'm going to cheat and ask you one more final question.
Yeah.
Just beyond Iran, your history of working on non-proliferation issues, what keeps you up at night, sort of that question? When you look at the landscape of nuclear power, not nuclear power, but nuclear weapons, where are your major areas of concern?
Well, I've just finished a new study on deterring nuclear terrorism, which will be on the Wilson Center website. And what I found striking is that the Iran case is one. Here, Iran's a state sponsor of terrorism, and we think that a nuclear 9/11 is the worst thing that could happen to America. We don't think about Iran in the context of nuclear terrorism now because the JCPOA is blocking Iran's access to a weapon and weapons usable materials. So we don't think of Iran as a potential source of nuclear terrorism, what everyone agrees is the worst case scenario for us, a nuclear 9/11. But there are three other countries, Pakistan, North Korea, and Russia. Each are at an inflection point, and where their programs are dynamic and changing and will pose a challenge for the next president.
Well, I look forward to reading your report, and maybe you can come back and talk to us about it.
Absolutely. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Rob.
Good.